sticking around.
Yeah. How do I turn this on? Let's go ahead and get started. Just mention once we start right after this panel, get that be in the Okay. Let me make sure. Can I turn them? How do we turn these on? I think we're going to start the next panel momentarily, so if people can return to their seats, that'd be great. We just need to get these mics turned on.
Well, the thing I was going to say is totally irrelevant. So good.
So we're going to start our first panel of the day, and it's titled "The Role of State and Local Regulators in Broadband Mergers and Policymaking." And I'm going to quickly introduce our three panelists and then jump right into Q&A here. Chris Mitchell is the director of the Community Broadband Networks Initiative with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance in Minneapolis. Todd O'Boyle is program director for Common Cause's Media and Democracy Reform Initiative, and Deb Socha is the executive director of Next Century Cities, a new initiative that strives to support community leaders across the country as they seek to ensure that all have access to fast, affordable, and reliable internet. And, I think a great way to get this panel started off, following Josh Wright's talk about the tension between the public interest and, I'd say modern antitrust economics and the consumer welfare test, would be to talk about the public interest at the state level. And a lot of people in here are thinking about a couple of the mergers, broadband mergers that are ongoing, the Altice and the Charter merger in particular. And what are the factors in a public interest analysis, and how do you see, is that changing at all, and how do you see state regulators, particularly of interest in New York, I think, doing that analysis? And happy to start with Chris.
It would be great to start about New York, I think.
All right, well, thank you, Teddy. And I'm here on behalf of Common Cause today, which is a nationwide nonpartisan network of roughly 400,000 members, 35 state chapters, including in states like New York and California that have the most direct purview over the mergers that we've been talking about. And one thing that I can say that we're cautiously optimistic, guardedly pleased with, is that state regulators seem to be awaking to their authority. That for too long, state PSCs and PUCs were often viewed as, for lack of a better term, a speed bump on the way to merger clearance at the federal level. But there are really important public interest concerns that state regulators are better attuned to because they're closer to the needs of the local consumers. So one thing that we often find ourselves in kind of this funny situation, because on the one hand, Common Cause is generally pretty skeptical of what behavioral conditions can do. The track record of behavioral conditions for advancing the public interest is not great. That said, we often find ourselves dialoguing with state-level regulators about that don't feel they have the authority to block a merger outright, that don't feel that the Cable Act allows them to do that. We often talk to them about what it would take to advance the public interest. And the public interest is about more than competition. The public interest is about more than the number of market players. It certainly includes that. But the public interest is also served in many ways. The public interest is affordability. The public interest is on the cable dial representation. The public interest is important issues like in the net neutrality context, whether voters can inform themselves online, whether they can organize online, whether they can speak for themselves. So it's a much broader standard, and often we're talking to, our members in the states are talking to regulators and saying, look, this may not have been on your radar, but my customer service experience with Charter is something you should know about. And I'm not picking on Charter, but I'm just using an example. Earlier this year, we organized mightily around the California Public Utilities Commission's public hearing on the Comcast Time Warner Cable merger. At that point, Comcast, Time Warner Cable, and Charter was also implicated, of course. And we had members that said, look, if you're deciding this on a public interest test, you really need to know about my customer service experience. And it wasn't positive. And there's nothing about this merger that would improve it. So I think a lot of the unique role of state-level regulators is their specific proximity and to the people that are the end users, that the public that constitutes the public interest. So I think the advantage of the public interest test is just how broad it is and what counts. And I'll, again, guardedly optimistic, cautiously pleased by state-level regulators awaking to their regulatory purview.
I think one of the challenges with the state regulators is that there is often a tremendous asymmetry between the industry, which is at the Public Utility Commission, the Public Service Commission every day, and the public, which is there on 0 days of the year for the most part. In states like California, where you have organizations that have funding to operate there, often as a measure of state law, then I think you have interesting things happen. New York also has dynamics that allow for that. But in Minnesota and most of the states I'm familiar with, the public has very little interaction with the PUC and the PSC. And frankly, a lot of times, to the extent that we even hear about it, it's with regard to energy. So the focus is on energy among the few groups that do appear there. So I think there's some good reasons for why we don't see a lot of effort around that. I tend to be skeptical of merger conditions because, to the extent that I'm aware of them, they tend not to be enforced. I tend to become aware of them in terms of articles that are pointing out that there's a merger condition that's not being enforced. And so one of the things actually I should have started off with is noting, in a room like this of specialists where I'm not a specialist, I often see myself as trying to bring forth what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing from the communities that I'm working with on a regular basis around the United States, the people that typically don't even know what, all the different levels of merger review that happen. So to some extent, I'm trying to reflect the things that I hear when I talk to people about them in City Hall. And one of those is that there's a sense that to the extent that we want to do anything around merger review, a lot of times it's not just to block the merger or to try and get conditions, but it's because that's a good opportunity to get people to just think about the role of consolidation and industry consolidation in their lives. we don't really have a strong hope. I mean, we saw this in the Comcast merger with Time Warner Cable. A lot of people didn't really expect it to be stopped, but we saw it as an opportunity to get people to be aware of what was happening and why their cable bills are going up and that sort of thing. So to some extent, what you see as energy around merger review at the state level tends to be toward other purposes or toward a larger purpose, as opposed to just trying to get a specific result in that single case.
Yeah.
I can't say I have anything to add. I would agree with Chris that my perspective is often about folks who are working in City Hall and their citizens and what their concerns are and where their issues are. And my goal is to represent that voice.
And I think, Todd, you mentioned briefly that there's hesitation at the PSC level to block mergers because there's questions around their legal authority. And how much of it is legal authority and how much of it is, or questions around that, and how much of their approach is just lack of political will. I mean, this is something that I think a lot of people in the audience try to gauge at the state level. If you could maybe talk about that briefly.
Well, political will always counts, and in the Comcast Time Warner Cable transaction that didn't happen, it is notable that Commissioner Florio at the California Public Utilities Commission did suggest an alternate proposed decision that would have blocked the merger, and would have blocked it within the state of California, no matter, irrespective of what might have happened elsewhere and what regulators in other states might have said. It does create some interesting political and sort of legal questions about what happens if the federal regulators approve a merger, but then say the state of New York says no. But I'd be happy to have that as a test case, and I'd love to have the problem of trying to sort that out. More to the present moment, it is encouraging to see the New York Public Service Commission, in particular, it's got a merger that is largely, if not completely, in New York with the Altice Cablevision transaction. The State Public Service Commission really has flexed its muscle recently in calling Verizon to account for its Fios franchise and noncompliance with some of the franchise terms. I think that shows a lot of political will and augurs well for the committee to take it, or the PSC to take its responsibility very seriously. With the Cablevision merger that's almost entirely, I don't know the exact footprint, but I think it's almost entirely in Long Island. So I think political will is growing, and that's a good sign for the public interest.
One of the challenges of political will, though, is that it's not happening in a vacuum. When I look at what's happening in Minnesota, where Comcast basically owns the state in the sense of it only offers service in the metro region, but it's so powerful with its all the money that it has, the way it's systematically given to nonprofits and spread its influence far and wide. Policy that's about broadband in rural areas is set by Comcast in the governor's office. Comcast is there before anyone else goes in and after anyone else leaves. They have this all-pervasive power, and it's remarkable because when you want to talk about merger review and that sort of thing, we're not coming from an even playing field. There's already a sense of who the elected officials are listening to day in and day out, if only because nobody else is organized to talk about telecom issues at that level. I was just recently speaking with activists in one city that were organizing an effort to try and bring competition to Comcast. And I said to them, be very careful with who you talk to, because you might be thinking you're just talking to a local nonprofit that you think will be interested, but it will turn out that they have members of Comcast on their board, they get a lot of money from Comcast, and they will be, conflicted at the best. And there was laughter from the people I was talking to on the phone, and they said, I wish you'd told us that 2 weeks ago, because the document that we gave to a local nonprofit in confidence showed up in Comcast's hands, and now they know all about it. And we see this on so many different levels. When you have a firm that has the kind of market power that a Comcast does, or in other states, a different provider that has sort of locked up that region, it's really hard to try and break through and to talk about these other issues, because those people came into office with Comcast money, and not just that, but their friends have worked for Comcast. I mean, the way in which Comcast really can dominate in an entire state is fascinating, and that changes the way everyone looks at things, because it's Comcast's point of view that's being disseminated in the media constantly, in the one-on-one sessions, and even through ostensibly independent organizations like nonprofits that are working on things like, technology policy or other policy for people that are in low-income neighborhoods.
And I'll add, the recent agreement between Comcast and the city of Philadelphia around their franchising agreement in the city was really an interesting opportunity for sort of grassroots folks, people at the ground level, to really push back on what was happening in their city. But what I'm really excited about is how that has influenced some of our other cities to think differently about how they work with those opportunities. So for example, Seattle was supposed to vote on their franchising agreement about 4 days after that article came out, and they said, I think we'll wait. I think we'll take a look at what that franchising agreement is currently and what we might be able to get based on what we're seeing happening. So I love seeing that kind of grassroots conversation and that pushback against exactly what you're talking about, Chris.
And so I want to make sure that we've kind of exhausted everything you guys have been hearing and what you think about Altice and Cablevision and Charter, Time Warner Cable. You guys have anything else to add just in terms of what you're hearing and sort of the ways that consumer groups are thinking about opposing those deals that wouldn't be giving away too much of the strategy here?
I'll just add that as an organization, Next Century Cities has a set of principles, one of which states that competition is a good thing. And we've seen that over and over again with our cities. When Google comes, how competition can really help to lower prices, increase speeds, almost every single time. I think we really want to encourage the opportunity for multiple providers within every market. And the fewer the providers, the less opportunity we see our cities have.
Right, and even though, in cable mergers, folks will often say, well, there's no household by household level competition, what difference does it make? Allowing the incumbent to get bigger forecloses, to some extent, future deployments. The bigger the big kid on the block is, the harder it is to move in on that block. And so one thing that we try and encourage state level regulators to think about is what might you be foreclosing. And to your question about Charter and Time Warner Cable, it is very encouraging that the California Public Utilities Commission is holding a public hearing at the end of January. I'm looking forward to that. It seemed to be a very important moment from an organizing standpoint, from a public interest standpoint, in April when the California Public Utilities Commission held the Comcast Time Warner Cable hearing. And I'm really optimistic that shows that they're scrutinizing the deal properly.
The mergers, I think, are deeply problematic. We struggle in our ability to come up with a strategy. I mean, the idea that we could give away a strategy, we don't have the kind of capacity to develop, a real strategy to some extent around these things. But we really become fearful when we see the kind of consolidation that's happening because of some of the tactics we've had to deal with. Some of those include some of the predatory pricing from incumbents, where because they're so infrequently have to deal with real competition on a city-by-city basis, the cities that have built their own networks will sometimes see these incredible deals that it's hard to prove, of course. You guys all know better than me that it's hard to prove predatory pricing. But we know people that are in similar NDA'd contracts, and they can tell us that there's no possible way to be delivering a product that they're delivering at the price point they're delivering without taking a loss every month for that subscriber. And we see, in the case of Minnesota, we certainly saw a case where the most egregious predatory pricing, where we estimate they were probably taking a loss in the order of $20 to $40 per month per subscriber that took the offer over a 2-year guaranteed deal. We're afraid that larger firms are able to do that more, and that smaller firms would not be able to engage in those kinds of losses just to drive competition from the market. Another thing that we've seen is is in some regions, certainly not everywhere, there appears to have been a coordinated campaign to hire the best people away from some of these startup outfits. And not so much just because they are really good people, but to get them away and to starve the startups for talent. And there again, I think you see more possibility of larger firms able to engage in that sort of behavior, because smaller firms that are operating probably on smaller margins are not able to just hire people to deny them to the competition and to just cause sort of HR havoc. I guess one of the things that it's interesting listening to people who have these deep, the deep econometric models about what the consolidation does. From our point of view, it tends to result in just an industry in which it is harder to have a new startup enter the field and to compete, because you're not just competing against an incumbent, you're competing against an incumbent that has such a wide footprint and has such an incredible advantage in terms of marketing across larger footprints, volume deals for content and for capital purchases. There's so many ways in which in this industry I feel like the larger the competition gets, the harder it is to have real competition in terms of small firms entering the market.
It's fascinating. I saw today that the omnibus legislation has a tax break for startups to get bought out. So the startup owner who gets bought out doesn't have to pay capital gains tax on getting bought out, which is, I imagine that problem could get worse.
That's actually, it's interesting, because that's why we support municipal and cooperative arrangements at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Specifically, and I'm very deeply conflicted, because I love these small companies that are starting up. That are not even the smaller ones that are starting up, but companies like C-Spire that are going into this in Mississippi. And they have a wonderful business model, and it seems to be working very well. As I anticipate in the next 5 to 10 years, rounds of consolidation where we'll lose that competition. My organization has embraced municipal networks specifically because over 100 years of electrification has taught us that municipal networks can provide diversity and resist being bought out. To give you an idea, we saw the private sector become tremendously consolidated, and I think that was actually detrimental for a variety of reasons. But municipal networks, municipal electric plants went from being about 3,500 to 2,000 today. Over 100 years, the consolidation has been pretty low compared to other industries. Compared to this industry in the private sector. I think because people recognize local control keeps their prices lower, keeps their maintenance budgets higher, and prevents the kinds of problems we see from National Grid up in New England.
To that, since we're talking about the omnibus, I think, Chris, you're right to use the term waves of consolidation, because the omnibus also includes a rider that facilitates broadcast consolidation. And the National Association of Broadcasters' rationale in pushing for that rider was to say, look, MVPDs are consolidating, so you have to let us consolidate. And we find this tit-for-tat arms race of consolidation that, from a public interest standpoint, we see as very problematic at Common Cause, and that irrespective of what economic efficiencies that they may present on paper, that there's a significant harm to the public interest and the ability of the informed electorate and anyway, to the public interest at large.
And I think we're running out of time, but I have two last questions. First is, is it new, in terms of the Altice deal, to be thinking about whether or not debt loads will make it more difficult to meet sort of build-out requirements and upgrade requirements? Is that something you guys are hearing about, or is that something that's not really coming up on the radar?
I think it's really encouraging that regulators are considering whether Altice's debt load would hinder the possibility of continuous upgrades, infrastructure upgrades, back-end upgrades, because by loading the deal up with debt, there's less capital there to invest. I think it's really encouraging that they're looking at that, and I hope that similar logic applies to other mergers that are pending.
Yeah, and I think that debt load will play a factor, but from what we've seen, the number one decision of whether to invest more is not so much one of debt, it's one of a fear of competition and losing customers. And so without that fear of competition, I'm afraid the debt load would be immaterial.
I have to say that's been my experience in talking to cities across the country, that when there is more than one provider, a really good provider within a community, then the investment increases.
And the last question is exactly about that. You know, I made some remarks at the opening about how can policymakers think about if new entry is so important, how can they think about, you know, how long should we think about that taking? How long is that going to take? And what are the policies that most facilitate that, you know, you guys are on the ground, you see some of this in communities. What are, you know, we've got some policymakers right here. What are the recommendations that you guys have for what would spur that type of entry?
Well, let me say that I'd like to. One of the first times I find myself agreeing with Tech Freedom in supporting passive infrastructure. Tech Freedom recently came out and talked about the many benefits of conduit systems and things like that municipalities can invest in, and I think that's absolutely correct. I think sometimes that doesn't do enough, but in some cases, and we've just been talking with people in Lincoln, Nebraska, where that is spurring competition. And in part, they've coupled both a conduit that's available in reasonable terms with a requirement that anyone puts in their own conduit also put in the city's conduit, which would make sure that no one can sort of build a monopoly area of town without also building conduit that would be open to competition. Some of these policies are very smart. However, we may need to see some communities doing more, I think, which would involve building their own networks, maybe some active components, and potentially even becoming a service provider themselves. Candidly, most cities don't want to do that. They'd prefer to have other providers enabled. But in some cases, we found that that is necessary, or that's the only way to finance the necessary infrastructure with the security to be able to pay it back.
So, and I'll suggest some of the things we talk to our cities about is exactly that. Dig once, joint use policies, also rights of way, one-touch pole attachments, permitting. How are you doing all these things in order to encourage people to work with you as a community and increase the potential for competition? And I'll also say, in addition to municipal networks, some of our cities have those. I would agree, most of our cities would rather not do that, but sometimes for them it's the only option. But some of our cities are beginning to look at other ways of bringing in competition, like with open access networks or public-private partnerships, like Westminster, Maryland, and Ting. And so I think opening your eyes to what other alternatives are available to make this happen, to ensure competition, is something we definitely encourage.
All right, maybe we take one question from the audience.
I'm glad Chris agrees with us about the value of infrastructure. I look forward to discussing that on the panel later today. But I thought that this panel was supposed to be about broadband mergers and policymaking. It's unfortunate that there wasn't another voice on the panel to push back against some of the things that were said. I don't actually have time to do that. I'll just say that you've only heard one side of those difficult issues today. But I do want to ask a question, which is, since you all deal with cities and states, are you following the FCC's claims that Section 706 allows not only it to do anything it wants that will promote broadband deployment, that's of course the rationale for the open internet ordering part, but also that under 706B, if in fact that statute is a grant of authority, that state regulators, whether it's the Attorney General or the state PUC, could do anything that they want that would promote broadband deployment. I can imagine that that might be a good thing for you in some ways if you think you could use that power, but aren't you concerned that that power, if it can be used so freely, could be used against you and could raise some troubling concerns if the state regulator can make the same sorts of specious arguments the FCC has made to justify its regulations? It's not hard to imagine state and local regulators making, or other state regulators making similarly loosey-goosey arguments that maybe shutting down muni broadband could promote broadband deployment overall, or censoring content, or who knows what. So are you following this, and are you concerned, and if not, why not?
Yes, and in fact, when we were looking at in the aftermath of the Verizon decision, and we were reading Section 706 more closely, for those of us who don't do this sort of thing regularly, we were trying to figure out how it will work at the state level, the way the statute's written, to engage in those sorts of 706 powers, because And I spoke with a Minnesota regulator on the Public Utility Commission, and he himself was just confused as to what they might do. I'm frankly concerned that we may see some really bad decision-making in terms of restricting local authority to encourage competition. But I think the biggest question is not one of what they would do, but how they would go about doing it. There's no mechanism, to my knowledge, for them to engage in these sorts of things. And so we've been waiting to see if any state would pick it up and run with it. But to my knowledge, none have yet.
Okay. Well, thank you so much to our panelists. We did attempt to have a little bit more diversity in terms of views on the panel. We got a couple people said no, so but I think we'll get plenty of that throughout the rest of the day. But thanks. Please thank our panelists and.
Feel free, it's very casual, just help yourself, and we'll go ahead and get started.
Thank you.